Halloween night started like any other night in my small, quiet town. I wasn't doing anything special this year. No parties, no costumes, no trick-or-treaters knocking on my door. I've never been big on Halloween anyway, and I figured I could use the night to catch up on some work that had piled up. Around 10 p.m. though, my car's low fuel light flickered on, and I realized I'd forgotten to fill up earlier in the day. My house was about a 15-minute drive from the nearest gas station, a lonely place that sat right on the outskirts of town, and I decided to take care of it before it slipped my mind. I threw on a jacket, grabbed my keys, and headed out into the night. The streets were eerily quiet, not even the distant sound of kids in costumes laughing or talking. The air had a biting chill to it, and the clear sky was dark, except for the full moon hanging overhead, casting a silvery glow on the empty town. As I drove, the quiet started to make me uneasy. You'd think after years of living in a small town, the empty streets would feel comforting, but on Halloween, they felt different. There was a strange sense of isolation in the air, as if something was lurking just beyond the reach of the dim streetlights. When I reached the gas station, I noticed the lights in the parking lot were flickering, casting eerie shadows across the cracked pavement. The station itself was barely lit, with only one of the two pumps working. The fluorescent sign on the roof, which read Carter's Gas, buzzed and flickered weakly, casting a dull glow over the empty lot. It felt like the whole place was on the verge of shutting down for good. I pulled up next to the working pump and got out of the car. The station had always been a little rundown, but tonight it seemed especially dilapidated, like it had been abandoned for years. The only sound was the hum of the flickering lights above. I inserted my card into the machine, trying to shake the unease gnawing at my gut. Something about the place felt wrong tonight, but I brushed it off as Halloween nerves. The pump clicked to life, and I stood there, staring off into the distance, trying to shake off the creeping anxiety. That's when I noticed something. A figure standing near the edge of the lot, barely visible in the faint light. At first, I thought it was a trick of the shadows, but as my eyes adjusted, I realized someone was standing there, just far enough away that I couldn't make out their face or details. The figure didn't move. They just stood there, watching. A chill ran down my spine, and my fingers tightened around the gas nozzle. Who would be standing out there in the dark, just watching someone at the pump? I glanced back at the station's window, hoping to see the attendant, but the inside looked just as dark and empty as the parking lot. There was no one behind the counter. The pump clicked, signaling that the tank was full. I yanked the nozzle out, fumbled to put the cap back on, and quickly got back into my car. I sat there for a moment, staring at the figure who still hadn't moved an inch. It was unnerving, just standing there, staring. I was half tempted to shout out and ask what they wanted, but something deep inside told me that was a terrible idea. I didn't want to draw any more attention to myself. Instead, I put the car in gear and slowly pulled out of the lot, my eyes flicking between the road and the figure in the distance. As I turned back onto the main road, I risked one last glance in the rearview mirror. The figure was gone. My heart skipped a beat, and I felt my hands tighten on the steering wheel. I hadn't seen them move, hadn't seen any sign of where they could have gone. The lot was empty now, but the sense of being watched still lingered in the air, like a weight pressing down on me. I tried to shake it off, convincing myself it was just my imagination running wild because it was Halloween night. The road back home was long and dark, with no other cars in sight. I drove in silence, the only sound the low hum of the engine, but after a few minutes I noticed something strange. A dim, flickering light in the distance, off to the side of the road. It looked like a set of headlights at first, but they were faint and irregular, almost as if they were struggling to stay on. I slowed down as I approached, my curiosity piqued. As I got closer, I realized it wasn't a car. It was another gas station, a small, run-down one, but one I had never seen before. It was impossible to miss, and yet I had no memory of ever passing this place, despite living in the area for years. The pumps were illuminated by a few dim lights that flickered like dying embers, and the sign above the station was completely dark. My heart pounded in my chest as I slowed the car to a stop, staring at the eerie, abandoned-looking station. I didn't need gas, but something compelled me to pull into the lot, maybe just to see what this place was, to satisfy the growing unease gnawing at my gut. As I pulled up next to the pumps, I noticed something strange in the reflection of my side mirror. There was movement, but it wasn't in front of me. It was behind me, My blood ran cold as I realized that someone was standing just beyond the edge of the gas station, barely visible in the flickering light. It was the same figure from earlier, standing there unmoving, watching. A cold sweat broke out on my forehead. I couldn't bring myself to turn around and look directly at them. My hands trembled on the steering wheel as I shifted the car into drive. Without looking back, I peeled out of the lot and sped down the road, my pulse racing. I didn't dare glance in the rearview mirror this time. I didn't want to see that figure again. The drive home felt like an eternity. When I finally pulled into my driveway, I hurried inside and locked the door behind me. My house was dark and silent, just as I had left it, but it didn't feel safe. I double-checked all the locks, pulled the curtains shut, and turned on every light in the house. I sat down on the couch, my heart still pounding in my chest. Who was that figure, and why were they following me? How had they disappeared so suddenly, only to reappear at another gas station miles away? I couldn't sleep that night. Every creak of the house, every shadow that shifted in the moonlight sent my nerves into overdrive. It felt like that figure was still out there, watching, waiting for me to let my guard down. Sometimes, when I'm driving late at night, I catch a glimpse of a shadow in my rearview mirror, and my heart skips a beat. I tell myself it's nothing, that it's just my imagination. But deep down, I can't shake the feeling that they're still out there, waiting for me to stop again. And I won't, not ever. I was returning from a long road trip, driving alone on a seemingly endless stretch of highway. It was one of those late, quiet nights where you can feel the isolation creeping in. The only sounds were the hum of the tires on the road and the occasional whoosh of wind against the car windows. Something was unsettling about the emptiness, like the whole world had gone silent. After hours of driving, I started to feel the fatigue setting in. I hadn't passed any signs of life for what felt like miles, and my fuel gauge was dipping dangerously low. The last thing I wanted was to run out of gas in the middle of nowhere, so when I finally spotted a dimly lit gas station up ahead, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. It was an old, rundown station, one of those places that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 80s. The neon sign above the building flickered, casting an eerie glow over the pumps. No other cars were in sight. No one was inside the station as far as I could tell. Just an empty parking lot and a few moths fluttering around the lights. I pulled up to the pump, exited the car, and refueled. The air was chilly, and I shivered as I stood there, glancing around. The station was eerily quiet, save for the soft buzzing of the lights. Something about the place made my skin crawl, but I brushed it off, figuring it was just my imagination running wild in the late-night gloom. As I was finishing up, I noticed a car pull into the station. It was an old, beat-up sedan, and it rolled up slowly to the pump on the opposite side of the lot. The windows were tinted, so I couldn't see inside, but something about the way the car moved made me uneasy. It was like the driver was trying too hard not to be noticed. I decided to ignore it and finished fueling. I just wanted to get back on the road and put some distance between myself and that gas station. But as I got into my car, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I glanced in the rearview mirror and noticed the driver of the other car hadn't gotten out yet. The car just sat there idling with no movement from inside. I started the engine, trying not to overthink it, but as I pulled away from the pump, I saw something that made my heart skip a beat. There was a small figure in the back seat of that car. At first I thought it was a doll or something, but then I realized it was a child, maybe 6 or 7 years old, sitting very still, staring out of the window. There was something strange about the way the kid was sitting, almost too stiff, like they were afraid to move. I hesitated, my instincts telling me something wasn't right. But what could I do? I didn't know the situation. Maybe it was just a kid sleeping or playing in the back seat while their parent fueled up. I told myself I was just being paranoid. But then the car door opened. A man stepped out, tall and thin, wearing a hooded jacket that obscured most of his face. He glanced around nervously, then slowly approached the back of the car, opening the rear door. He didn't see me watching as he leaned in and spoke to the child in a low voice. The kid didn't respond, just sat there, unmoving. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. The whole scene felt wrong, off in a way that I couldn't explain. The man wasn't behaving like a parent with their kid. There was no sense of familiarity or warmth in his movements. Instead, he seemed agitated and hurried, like he was trying to rush the kid into doing something. I knew I couldn't just drive away without doing anything. I wasn't sure what I was getting myself into, but I had to know if something was wrong. I pulled my car into a spot near the station's convenience store, parking far enough away that I wouldn't be too obvious, but close enough to keep an eye on the man and the child. From where I was sitting, I could see the man was now holding the kid's arm, trying to pull them out of the car, but the kid was resisting, digging their heels into the seat. That was it. I couldn't just sit there anymore. I got out of my car and walked towards the store, pretending to head inside for a snack, but just trying to get a better look at what was happening. The man noticed me and immediately stiffened, his grip on the kid tightening. "Hey," I called out, my voice wavering slightly. "Everything okay over there?" The man straightened up and shot me a look. His eyes were dark, his expression unreadable. "Yeah," he said gruffly, "just getting my kid out of the car." The kid was staring at me now, their eyes wide and pleading. Something was wrong. "Your kid doesn't look too happy," I said, trying to keep my tone casual but firm. "You sure everything's all right?" The man glared at me, and I could see the tension in his face. He was nervous, maybe even scared, and that only made me more suspicious. Without another word, he yanked the kid out of the car, pulling them towards the passenger seat. I couldn't stand by any longer. My heart was racing, but I had to do something. "I don't think that's your kid," I said louder this time, hoping someone else might hear. The man froze for a second, then turned to face me fully. His expression was cold, calculated. "Mind your own business," he hissed, his voice low and threatening. I backed up, my hands shaking, but I wasn't going to let him leave with that child. I reached for my phone, quickly dialing 911 as I kept my eyes on the man. He saw what I was doing and panicked. He shoved the kid into the car and jumped into the driver's seat, slamming the door shut. The engine roared to life, and before I could do anything, the car sped out of the parking lot, disappearing into the night. My hands were still trembling as I spoke to the 911 operator, giving them a description of the car and the man. I felt helpless, standing there in the empty gas station lot, knowing that kid was out there, scared and alone with a man who was not their parent. The police arrived within minutes, but by then the car was long gone. They took my statement, and I gave them every detail I could remember. The make and model of the car, the man's appearance, the child's desperate eyes. I couldn't shake the image of that kid, sitting so still in the back seat, as if they knew something terrible was about to happen. For days after the incident, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I called the police several times to check if they had found the car or the child, but every time I got the same answer. No leads, no updates. Weeks passed, and the memory of that night started to fade, but it never truly left me. Every time I passed by a gas station, I found myself scanning the area, half expecting to see that same car, that same man. But I never did. Then one evening, months later, I saw a news report. A child had been found wandering along a highway, miles from the nearest town. They had no memory of how they got there, and they were too traumatized to speak. The report didn't give many details, but I knew. Somehow deep down, I knew it was the same kid. I never found out what happened to them, or the man who took them, but I'll never forget the way they looked at me that night at the gas station. A look of pure terror, begging for help that I couldn't give. That night, I learned that evil doesn't always wear a mask or lurk in the shadows. Sometimes it's right in front of you, hidden in plain sight. And sometimes all you can do is watch helplessly as it drives away into the darkness. I had been on the road for hours, far longer than I'd planned. The route was supposed to take me through a few small towns, but I somehow found myself in the middle of nowhere, driving down a lonely stretch of road. No signs, no landmarks, just an endless ribbon of asphalt cutting through the dark, featureless landscape. My phone's GPS had given up miles ago, stuck in a perpetual recalculating loop that only deepened my growing frustration. I had no idea where I was, and the gas tank was starting to creep dangerously close to empty. The road stretched on, black and desolate, with nothing but the beams of my headlights cutting through the darkness. It was that kind of deep, oppressive darkness where the stars and moon seemed hidden behind some invisible veil. My stomach twisted with unease. There were no houses, no lights, not even another car in sight. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the hum of the engine and the occasional crackle of gravel under the tires. I needed to find a gas station or a place to stop, but with every mile, it felt like I was getting further from civilization. Then, like a mirage in the desert, a faint glow appeared in the distance. I squinted, trying to make out the shape through the darkness. As I drew closer, I realized it was a gas station, an old one by the looks of it, with a single flickering light above the pumps. The building was small and worn, the kind of place that had seen better days decades ago. But it was a lifeline, and I had no choice but to pull in. I parked by one of the pumps, glancing around. The station looked abandoned. The windows of the small convenience store were grimy, and the shelves inside were half empty. There was no one at the counter, and no other cars in the lot. The open sign flickered weakly in the window, but there was an eerie stillness about the place that sent a shiver down my spine. I stepped out of the car and grabbed the gas pump, grateful for at least one small comfort. I could fuel up and be on my way. As I stood there, waiting for the tank to fill, I glanced around the lot. That's when I saw it, a figure standing off to the side, near the corner of the building. It was barely visible in the dim light, just a shadowy outline against the wall. My heart jumped into my throat. The figure wasn't moving, just standing there, watching. I told myself it was probably the station attendant, though the way they stood so still unnerved me. I kept my eyes on the pump, willing the tank to fill faster. The seconds dragged on and my unease grew. When I finally dared to glance back, the figure was gone. A cold sweat broke out across my skin. My heart pounded in my chest as I quickly finished up and capped the tank. I wanted to leave now, but then I remembered I had to pay, and the station didn't look like it was set up for self-serve. Cursing under my breath, I grabbed my wallet and headed toward the convenience store. As I approached the entrance, I hesitated. The door was cracked open, swinging slightly in the night breeze. Inside, it was even more desolate than it had appeared from the outside. The fluorescent lights inside flickered, casting long, jittery shadows across the empty aisles. I pushed the door open, and the old bell above it gave a feeble chime. "Hello," I called out, my voice echoing in the stillness. No answer. The store seemed empty, but there was something off, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I walked up to the counter, hoping to find some indication of what to do next, but the register sat silent, untouched. The sense of isolation weighed down on me like a thick fog. And then I heard it, footsteps, faint but unmistakable, coming from the back room behind the counter. My stomach churned. I leaned forward, straining to hear. The footsteps stopped just as suddenly as they had started. There was a moment of dead silence, then a slow creak like someone pushing a door open very carefully. My instincts screamed at me to leave, but I was rooted to the spot. I didn't want to find out who or what was in that back room, but my curiosity got the better of me. I took a cautious step forward, craning my neck to peer over the counter. That's when I saw him. A man stood in the doorway to the back room, his face obscured by shadows. His clothes were ragged, his posture stiff, but what scared me the most was his eyes. They were wide, unblinking, and locked onto me with an intensity that made my blood run cold. I stumbled back, my heart hammering in my chest. The man didn't move. He just stood there staring as if he was waiting for something. Every instinct told me to run, to get out of there as fast as I could, but I couldn't move. My feet felt glued to the floor. Then, without warning, the man took a step forward. I bolted. I ran out of the store, not bothering to look back. I slammed into my car, fumbling with the keys in my shaking hands. When I finally managed to get the door open, I threw myself inside, locked the doors, and peeled out of the lot, my tires screeching against the pavement. As I sped down the empty road, my heart still racing, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For a brief moment, I saw the man again, standing in the middle of the road, watching me disappear into the night. I didn't stop driving until I reached the nearest town, several miles away. I pulled into a brightly lit gas station, this one bustling with activity, and sat there for a long time, trying to calm my nerves. I never went back to that stretch of highway again. I don't know who that man was or why he was there, but the thought of him, standing in the middle of nowhere, still haunts me. Sometimes when I drive at night, I can almost feel those eyes watching me from the shadows, waiting for me to stop again.